All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. And it looks like we have a great turnout. And I want to thank Krista and Anne-Marie for facilitating this second of our discussions with me and our great teachers out there. The teachers are what makes things go for adult education literacy. We did one of these presentations a few weeks ago and covered measurable skills gains. These are our interim measures for student performance, and we went through some of the first three measurable skills gains. Today, we're going to tackle measurable skills gains 3, 4, and 5. While we do that, we're going to get into, these are really related to IET programs, and you'll see what I mean in just a second. And as part of that, we're going to also have a discussion on something called programs of study. So let me just start with a little bit of review from what we talked about last week or a few weeks ago, and just go through these measurable skills gains. So these are these interim measures that we're very used to. Teachers are very used to this, and they document not only academic, and that's what we're largely focused on last webinar, but also technical and occupational skills. And today we're going to really talk about measuring these technical and occupational skills, training program skills. These measures, as I think we're all familiar, are common across workforce programs and BR programs, and that really helps us with our data sharing and some of that other information. And then we have an AEL letter 0118 change 1, which really describes in much greater detail these measurable skills gains. Okay, so if you recall, we talked about these initial skills gains last week, the type 1A, type 1B, and the 2 in that previous webinar. And these are the ones that measure academic performance. And every participant in Texas is in the denominator, meaning they're going to be counted towards this performance for the academic basic education MSGs. The group we're going to discuss today are the workforce training in integrated education and training, or IET model MSGs. And not every participant gets counted in those, only, as the name implies, participants that are in integrated education and training programs. So let's talk about what these measurable skills gains are. So we call them the workforce training IET MSGs. Kind of a long name. I wanted to make sure that we were very clear that these MSGs, 3, 4, and 5, only pertain to individuals that are in IET programs. So as we go through, there's 3 different types of these. And the first one is called the post-secondary transcript or report card. And we're going to go through that in just a second here. But before we go through that type 3 MSG, I want to talk a little bit about how we measure these workforce training MSGs, or these IET MSGs. As I said earlier, in basic education, and for every student, you've got to have a student's performance is measured every program year for a basic education MSG. So you're going to do a pre-post test, or the individual is going to enter post-secondary education and training after they've exited, or you're going to do a high school equivalency as a measurable skills gain. And those are what we reviewed in the last webinar. In these workforce training IET MSGs, they're not measured every year. They're measured every program of study. And you might be thinking, what's a program of study, Anson? What is he talking about? Well, let's talk about it. In an IET, many of you are probably well aware that an IET has a lot of different components. It's got basic education that's contextualized. It has workforce or occupational training, so training for a job. And then it has the workforce preparation activities, these employability skills, these marketable skills, these soft skills, including things like digital literacy. All of those things wrapped together would be called a program of study. I've got a great example of one of these. I think sometimes communicating through examples is the best way to do this. So if you look here, this would be considered an IET program of study. And if you're at a college, that's a term you're probably familiar with. They'll say they use programs of study quite a bit, also in CTE programs in high schools. But here you can see, and I color-coded them just for everybody's convenience. You've got the blue, which is our contextualized basic education. So there's some courses on reading and writing that are contextualized in math. The green boxes there, that's the occupational or workforce training. Medical terminology, this is for pharmacy technology. Intro to pharmacy, drug classifications, pharmacy math, etc. So that's the training program. Could be offered by a college or some other training provider. And then workforce preparation activities, they just kind of get interspersed throughout. All of that wrapped together is the program of study. And it's kind of probably what most of us would be familiar with would be when you went to college, you had a degree plan. And the degree plan, said, Anson's got to take psychology 1301, and he's got to take algebra, and he's not going to do very well at it, and he's got to take all these electives. That's your degree plan. In workforce training and in IETs, we call that the program of study. Very, very similar thing. So remember I said you've got to have a basic education MSG every program year. That's what the student is out there to earn every year. And so here we see this program. It's spread over 3 semesters and 2 program years. And so this individual would be in the denominator and need to earn a basic education twice. But the workforce training, remember, it only pertains to a program of study. So they would the program of study would only require one of these workforce training and IETs that we're going to talk about today. So you can kind of see it's a different environment than your standard student that's an ESL or an HSC preparation, for example, where you're just really there chasing post-tests and high school equivalencies and stuff to get a basic education gain. In an IET, it's a little bit more complex. There's a lot more learning going on. There's basic education learning, but also this technical training. And remember the MSG definition from the earlier slide. It measured academic, occupational, and technical training. Well, IET has all of those elements, and these different MSG types measure these different elements, so you can really show the full breadth of student learning, not just basic education learning, but technical learning while they're in the program. So let's go through one of these. And do we want to have any questions here real quick? Are there questions in the chat there for me yet?
No questions yet.
Okay, perfect. So let's go through this first measurable skills gain for workforce training and IET. It's called the post-secondary transcript or report card. And this is called the Type 3. So I'm going to go through what it is and then kind of talk a little bit about the details of it. Now, this one is pretty exciting for some reasons, especially if you're at a college, because it's a very easy one to collect data on. So first off, it pertains only to college credit IETs. Now, we don't have a lot of AEL providers doing IETs with college credit. They're growing quite a bit, but this MSG could only be used if the student is enrolled in a college credit IET. But if you're not doing IETs in college credit right now, just pay attention because you might get there. And it's earned and documented through a transcript or report card. So as the student passes classes, if we reflect back to that pharmacy tech example, they're going to pass I'm going to go back to it. They're going to pass the drug classification, or they're going to pass the pharmacy math or the intro to pharmacy. That would be documented on a report card or on the transcript. And if they passed it, that could be a credit for this workforce training in IET. Very easy. If you're at a college, man, you can just pull that transcript up and see exactly the student performance and then log it, as you see here on the educational outcomes screen in Teams. This IET, of course, it has to lead to a post-secondary credential. you would want to get documentation of that, transcript or report card. So you'd print out the information from your data management system if you're at a college, or you might get a copy of the student report card if you're not at a college, and file that as a hard copy for monitoring purposes, and then record it on the educational outcomes screen. And there you go. You've got a measurable skills gain in IET for this occupational training. It's a pretty convenient one.
Okay.
There's some. They got a question. Yes.
We do. Yes. This is from Gareth Wingfield. Is this something we want or expect all programs to do, or if programs have IETs already, should the non-IET instructors take from the IET material to contextualize for non-IET classes?
Boy, read that one to me one more time.
I will.
It's got a lot in it. I like it.
Yes. Okay. Is this something we want or expect all programs to do? Or if programs that have IETs already, should the non-IET instructors take from the IET material to contextualize for non-IET classes?
This is an option, first off. It's not something we expect everybody to be doing. The measurable skills gain is just one of 3 options to measure the workforce training. There's a reference there to the IET curriculum, and most definitely contextualization of that curriculum needs to be going on with the basic education content. And that would be, the basic education piece, and then the workforce training would represent what you would be measuring with the report card, if I understood the question accurately. So we have some exclusions to this, meaning not every course that you're taking at a college is going to count. It's only for the workforce training courses. So I get these questions, okay, so if I get a transcript and it just shows the student is in developmental education, can I use that? No, that's excluded from the measure. College ESOL classes, student development courses, these are all excluded, meaning they don't count towards a measurable skills gain because these are prerequisite courses. They're not the training courses, but they're courses that help you get ready to pass the training courses. So those are excluded from the measure. We're only talking about the actual training courses that are required for the occupational training. There's some other clarifications here. It's got to be full-time, so the student must be attending and get credit for 12 hours in a semester. Now, so it can be full or part-time, but it's got to be a 12-hour full-time load, or it can be part-time if it's spread over 2 semesters, and I have an image explaining that. So say the student takes 6 hours of technical training and workforce training in one semester and then 6 hours the next. You wouldn't get credit till the second semester because it's got to be 12 hours cumulative. Passing, meaning you have to show a passing grade on this report card or transcript. Passing is determined by the training provider or the college and by the standards of that college. So in some colleges, most colleges, a C is passing, but there are some instances where a D is passing. If that is the case, you would want to have documentation through something like the college handbook, what the passing score is for a class or for a program of study. It's an individual grade in the class, not a GPA. So it can't be one of these instances where the student fails a course, but then they get A's in the other courses, but they have a C average. It's each individual course has to show passing. And all of that kind of information you would definitely want to have handy for monitoring purposes. So if a monitor came out and the student had D's on their report card and the monitor said, well, I don't think D is passing, you would want to show in the institutional handbook, yes, for this program, in this example, D would be passing. So there is some kind of backup documentation you want to have, which is not uncommon if you're working at a college for sure. But if you're outside of a college, you're at a school district or ESC or other training provider and you want to work with a college, you'd want to make sure you're getting this information for your own accounting purposes, to have a copy of that college handbook that shows what the passing grades are, etc. Yes.
Anson, I'm sorry. This is from Mary Cruz Boothby. So just passing one course or two courses will not count as a gain, correct?
That's correct. You've got to have a gain of either 12 hours in the semester or 12 hours over 2 semesters.
And then another question here is it's passing everything in the semester.
It's passing everything that's included in the program of study. So here's what I mean. Let's go back to this example. That's a great question. Thank you. So here's the program of study, for example, in a pharmacy tech. Now, a student might take only these classes, but they might decide to take a geography class because they think it's awesome and interesting, or a history class. And that's not part of the program of study. So if they took the history class and they failed it, God forbid, but if they failed it, it wouldn't matter because it's not part of the program of study. So the report card and the passing only pertains to the technical or workforce training courses in the program of study. But as we know, students like to take, a full load. They like to take other courses sometimes, which is great. But you would only be getting credit for the courses that were in the program of study. If the monitors came up and you said, well, I got 12 hours, and they said, well, yeah, but 2 of those, or 6 of those 12 hours are non-program of study courses. There's a psychology course in here and an elective that's called Introduction to Rock and Roll or something. You couldn't count those courses. They wouldn't count towards the 12 hours, and it wouldn't matter if the student passed or failed those courses.
Okay. And if this person fails pharmacy law, it won't count as a basic education MSG.
Correct.
Okay.
That is never going to count as a basic education MSG. That would be a workforce training MSG. Remember, the basic education MSGs measure reading, writing, math, or ESL. The workforce training and IETs, the one we're talking about on this webinar, measure the workforce training, which is like pharmacy law or community pharmacy practice in this example on the screen.
Okay. And one more, if they take more than 12 hours, like 16 or 20, does it count if they pass 12 hours of courses and failed the other 4?
They need to be passing at least 12.
Okay. Okay, he says thanks.
Okay, awesome. Good question. And I apologize, I'm not seeing these questions. I see them pop up on my screen, but they're not showing up on my actual screen. But you're doing a great job there, Krista, so thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's go to the next one, and we'll be able to have questions as we go through, as you guys formulate them, because I understand this is very new content for many of you. The next measurable skills gain type, and remember these are options. You can use any one of these that fits your model. This is one I really find exciting, but we haven't seen a lot of people using this yet. So, man, be the first on your block to use the progress milestones in IET MSG, because it's a really, really convenient one, and you'll see why, I think. So you might see this referred to as the Type 4 progress milestone. It's outlined in our AEL letter. And this is showing satisfactory or better progress towards substantive skill development in workforce training or employment as identified by an employer. So this is what, if you're doing work with employers in an IET, this is the one that you would really want to use. And I'm going to explain this, and then it'll come to life when we go through an example. So the training provider, the grantee, would identify the appropriate methodologies and documentation for satisfactory or better progress based on the workforce training competencies. What that means is you're going to negotiate with the employer on what performance looks like, what good performance looks like. So it's not based on a test necessarily. It's not based on necessarily any kind of exam or test. It's based on something that the employer identifies. And let's see what that might be. So we call these milestones. And they could be a training report from the business that says, the individual has identified and has accomplished these skills. So I'll give you an example of an employer saying, I want my workers, these 25 people, to be able to implement a certain process. And you're going to train them on this technical training process. And he's going to say they have to be able to do X, Y, and Z, or maybe A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all these different skills. Now, you don't have a test that measures those skills, but the students can demonstrate those skills. And if they do that, and you have a way to kind of document that through some sort of, testing, meaning you performance testing, you say, okay, can you do this process? Can you implement this? Can you turn this on? And they can do those skills, then you document it and you can go back to the employer and say, like, I can verify that these 25 workers, 18 of them have met that benchmark. They've met the milestone and been able to implement that piece of technical training that you wanted us to do. Other examples, and I have a real good example in the next slide. Other things could be completions in apprenticeship programs of competencies, or for an on-the-job training in OJT. Increases in pay, and I want to talk about that one a little bit, or other performance documented by the employer. So say you're working with an employer and he wants to promote 3 of these workers. He needs to fill 3 foreman positions, and they need to have supervisory skills. They need to learn how to keep track of making a work schedule, and these kind of tasks. And he says, if these workers, if some of them can achieve these tasks, and I will give them a raise of 3%, say, it'd be great. You could just use that increase in wages as documentation of a skills gain, a workforce progress milestone skills gain. So it's really wide open in terms of what you could do. Let me give you an example, and then we could probably take some questions. So here's an example that I've worked on before. So this is what I know pretty well, and I have an image of it coming up. So an employer buys a computer numeric controlled machine to do some precision laser cutting. This is a very expensive machine. They cost about $500,000, and it's a big investment. Now, none of the workers in the plant know how to use this machine. And the employer says, hey, we want to do an IET. These are great workers, but their math skills are a little weak, and they need to operate this machine. Now, can you train them to operate the machine, and can you teach them some math? And you say, yeah, that sounds like a great IET. His goal, he wants to reduce waste and increase the speed for custom orders. So he's got an objective to make more money to process parts quicker. The CNC operation requires a lot of math, real contextualized math. You've got to enter things into a control panel, and it creates kind of a blueprint that the laser cuts out the piece of steel. And some of y'all might be familiar with this kind of stuff. It's very common in machining. So the workers come in, and say you have 9 workers you're going to train, and you've got to learn how to use this machine. There's all kinds of skills they have to document, so they don't, waste materials, so they don't blow the machine up, so they don't get hurt using the machine. And it takes math, takes technical training, and the IET is doing both of those things. Now, you set up some benchmarks, and you work with the employer and say, okay, here's the operating manual for the machine. Here's some skills that we've identified they've got to be able to do. They've got to be able to put in a raw piece of material and enter these various math problems so they can machine the part to specifications up to 1/1000th of an inch. And if they do it, out of that range, out of those parameters, they failed. So you've set up, based on the specifications of what the employer needs, criteria, milestones. And then you test the workers across that. You've taught them, you're working on the machine, you're teaching them math they need. And you test them and say, well, 6 of the 9 individuals have completed these skills that you told us you wanted, Mr. and Mrs. Employer. And he says, okay, that sounds good to me. So those 6 workers have met the skill standard. They've met the milestone. And you could count those 6 for performance. The 3 others, they need more help, and they're going to have to just retake the class. But for those 6, you could get this workforce training milestone. And I've put this kind of in an example here. So look at that. It's an IET for CNC machine operator. Very common, not an uncommon training program. They're learning math, so they're getting their basic education MSG at the top there. They pre-test, they post-test, and they've got some math skills they've developed. Then on the workforce training in MSG, they get the Type 4, which is this milestone that we've been describing here. So you've got an IET, you've got your basic education, you've got your workforce training within the program of study, and then you see at the very end, they get a credential for NIMS, the National Institute for Metalworking Skills. Very prestigious credential for them to have, very durable in the labor force. So full program of study and all the things being captured through MSGs, basic ed, and workforce training, and a credential at the end. Any questions come in on that yet, Krista?
Yes, there is a question here, and it goes back to that raise. And it's this is from Gareth, and it says, to be clear, if our students in a regular GED class that is not associated with the business reports, I got a raise. That does not count as a Type 4 because the class itself is not associated with the business.
Correct.
Okay.
So your example there, you're not describing an IET. Remember, these are called workforce training and IETs. It sounds from that example that the student is in a basic education class only, a GED prep class or a high school equivalency prep class. So it's great they got a raise. That will actually count for earnings performance. You know, that's a good thing. But it wouldn't count because they're not in an IET. It wouldn't count for a workforce training IET. Excellent example. Great question. Any others come in yet?
Nope, that was the latest.
Okay, so that's the conclusion of this one. And I'm going to move on, and then we can keep on talking through these. They're complex. They're new. Don't be afraid to ask questions because you're probably going, whoa, what is all this? I've never seen this. And they're really exciting, but they're very different for us. And we've got some great guidance written on them, so don't be afraid to start digging around and looking for more information. And for sure, ask us questions. So the next one is called the skills progression in IET. And this one is based around different types of workforce training testing. When I say that, I'm not saying TABE testing or BEST Plus testing or CASAS testing. I'm saying workforce training testing, credential testing. So let's see what this looks like. It's called the Type 5 MSG Skills Progression. Okay, so this one, again, is in 0118 AEL letter. And here, the student has to successfully pass an exam required by an occupation. It could be a credentialing exam to earn a certificate, certification, or license. Or they can make progress in attaining technical or occupational skills by evidenced by trade-related benchmarks. So let's talk about what these look like. And I have some good examples of these. And, of course, this one is going to require you to get the documentation from the student and file it, as well as enter it into Teams on the educational outcome screen. So let's talk about what trade-related benchmarks are. So these are tests necessary to obtain a credential. So, again, let's use an analogy from when we went to college. When you went to college, you took lots of final exams in your courses. And all of those exams, all of those finals for each course added up to your degree. This is very similar. These are tests that are objective workforce training tests that lead to a credential that would be the credential that would become the end of the IET. And I'll have an example of this. So they also can include employer-required knowledge-based exams. but they're a component of taking tests until you get your final test. Another analogy would be getting your driver's license. When you get your driver's license, you take a written test and you take a driving test, and then you get your license. If you just take the written test and pass it, it doesn't matter. You can't go drive with that. You've got to have both of those tests combined to earn the license, which would be your credential, for example. So let's look at some examples here. And before we look at them, I want to tell you, these are not tests that are like exams that you would take in college to complete courses. These are industry tests. So it's not a community college test like those report cards we talked about earlier. This is a test for that's issued by a workforce training organization. We sometimes call them industry recognized credentials. So here's an example from a real program that I used to run, and you can see a lot of things going on here, but this was a certified production technician program. And here it's a 2-year program. So remember, 2 years means 2 basic education MSGs. CPT is really math intensive, so you can see they're just doing a lot of math for their basic education MSG. But if we turn our eyes to the bottom, you see lots of industry testing going on there. And any of these would count as a workforce training in IET. So the student starts the program of study. They take a safety class, and that could be an OSHA safety class. You saw in the previous example here, I had an OSHA card. That's an OSHA card that a student earns after 10 hours of safety testing. Right there, boom, that could count as your Type 5 workforce training in IET. And honestly, you only need 1 for the whole program of study, but here you got 4. So because this is really real life. This is what you want for the student to pass so they can succeed. The next one is quality practices and measurements, maintenance awareness, and then manufacturing processes. So all of these are individual tests. They're required for the MSSC Certified Production Technician certification. If you're at a college, you're probably very familiar with this. And you have to pass all 4 of those to get the CPT credential, which you see at the end there. But for your performance in AEL, you really only need to have 1 of these documented. You want to have all 4 of them passed so the student gets the credential, but for our purposes, we only require you to record 1 of those in Teams. So I know there are some questions coming in.
Yes.
Let's see what we got there.
Okay. So one of the questions was, would getting CPR certified work?
And the answer to that would be yes, if CPR is part of the program of study. And it is in some programs. So in some of the healthcare programs, I've seen it in CNA, everybody gets to see a CPR. Now, it's a pretty easy. You can do that in a day. But you could count that as a workforce training Type 5 MSG if it's part of the program of study.
It does have to be CPR for medical professionals?
Again, it depends on what the course required for the program of study is. So if the training provider requires CPR for medical professionals as part of the required coursework, then yes, that one could be included.
Okay, that's it for now.
Okay, good. I got one more here. This is a HVAC, or heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and refrigeration program of study. You see all these courses here, very common coursework here. So it's 1 program a year. There's 1 basic education MSG at the top. This is an ESL student, so they're going to probably do a Best Plus test there, or a Best Literacy test, maybe a CASAS. And then you see at the bottom, the HVAC program of study requires OSHA 10, again, your safety, the NCCER core, which is a credential that recognizes several different competencies required for basic maintenance and basic construction training. And then for HVAC, there is a required Environmental Protection Agency training for hazardous gases called the EPA 608 Universal. And that's required to get the credential of an HVAC Level 1 certificate in this program of study. So all of that together packaged, any one of those would count as your workforce training and IET Type 5 MSGs, and then you've got your basic education pre-post test. After the last webinar, I got some questions from folks about the post-secondary enrollment basic education MSG. So turn the channel in your minds and go back to basic education MSGs. And remember, we talked about this post-secondary enrollment MSG. This is where an individual enrolls in post-secondary education or training after they exit, but within the program year. And that was one, it's got a lot of little nuances to it. I always try to remember it around these three things. Did the student enroll in post-secondary training after they've exited and within the program year? And if they met all three of those, boom, you got a post-secondary enrollment MSG. So what I want to do is show some examples. I showed a few the last webinar. I'm going to go through some more because they really, there's a lot of examples and variations out there. Some of them work, some of them don't. And I'm going to show you some that don't also. So here's a basic education. First off, these kind of courses don't enroll. So if the student just exits adult ed and they go right into developmental education, that's not considered post-secondary education. That's still remediation. And you really haven't gained much except now they're just paying tuition for basic education services. So things like that, ESOL, are excluded. These have to be real college courses that they're enrolled in. So here's your classic example, example number one. Here's an example. The student is in a period of participation in program year one. They exit, remember it's 90 days with no service, and then they enroll in post-secondary education within the program year. So remember the three things. Did the student enroll in post-secondary education before June 30th? Yes. Have they exited? Yes. Is it within the program year? Yes. So there you would get a gain. Let me do another one. Here's another example, and we went over this one last time. College prep boot camp. This is really short term. Look, 25 hours. So you might think, oh my God, 25 hours. I can't post test. Well, you don't have to post test if they're going to enter post-secondary education and training after they exit within the program year, and here they do. So now you could do these short-term boot camps that we love to do in the summer before students enroll, or in the late fall before they enroll in the spring. And you don't have to go chase a post-test because if they enroll in post-secondary and exit in the program year, you can count it.
Does military entrance count for the post-secondary MSG?
And right now it currently does not count, and that's a question that has come up a lot. I think everybody would agree that entering the military is work, but that is not currently included as occupational or as post-secondary training, even though you get training in boot camp and whatever training you do while you're in the military. So that does not count. And we've advocated for that with the Department of Education before, but they haven't budged yet. So here's another example. Now look at this one and ask yourself those three questions. Could you report this as a measurable skills gain? Just think about the three criteria we just taught you. The answer is no, because they didn't exit and enter post-secondary in the program year. See, there's a gap. They waited until January, it looks like, before they enrolled in post-secondary. So that's the next program year. So you couldn't count this one. And you'd be singing the blues there on your performance for that first program year. Let's do another example here. So this is a question that I've gotten before, and the question has to do with really short-term training. And for me, CNA, Certified Nurse Aide, comes to mind. You can get that done in, about 6 weeks or something, and that's less than 90 days. So you don't have to, the student can already have exited and finished the training before they've ever exited adult ed, and you can still get credit for this. So all that we're looking for in the performance is, did the student exit? Yes. Did they enter post-secondary training before the end of the program year? Yes. And they just finished the training shorter than the 90 days for exit, but that doesn't matter. The exit would be retroactive as long as they didn't come back to adult ed. If they came back right after their CNA training because they didn't want to go to work, first you'd scold them and say, you're supposed to get a job, but maybe they want to get their GED too. If they re-enrolled, then they would not have exited within those 90 days. You can do short-term, but you got to make sure they don't come back and enter into adult education services. Think about this one and place your bets in your groups. This individual's in an HSC preparation, then they enter an IET. Is this reportable? Can you get performance for this? No. The participant never exits because when they go into an IET, that is an AEL service. Now you might say, well, there's training involved there, and there is. There's post-secondary education and training, Anson, but they should count it. But they're still getting basic education services because they're in an IET. So that would not count, kind of a trick question. So I see we got some other questions here. Krista, you want to read those off to me?
I will. Must a participant wait 90 days to enroll in post-secondary or finish period of participation and exit and go directly to college?
Okay, so no, they don't have to wait 90 days. That's a good question. So you can see in these examples here, they're not waiting 90 days. They're going right in. Now, you don't want to wait too long, like in this example, because here they exited and they entered post-secondary in the outside of the program year, remember. But you don't have to wait the 90 days. And this example shows it. They didn't wait for 90 days. They enrolled the student right away, get them while they're hot, while they're in education, and then the student didn't wait around, and they exited even after the end of the training in this example. So, no, you do not have to wait 90 days.
Here's another question. We have several students that are in HSC/GED or ESL courses and are also in a college credit course on track to receive a certificate or degree. So our students will not make a gain because they haven't formally exited our program. You explain the reasoning behind this.
Sure. So, yes, that is an excellent question, and the answer is no. They will not get a gain because they're still AEL participants. The rationale, and this goes back, the reasoning behind it goes back to the federal law, actually, WIOA, and the regulations around performance. And I can tell you the philosophical thinking is this. If a student is going to college, but they're still in adult basic education, they really haven't gotten college ready, essentially. They're still getting remediation. Now, they may be in college courses and stuff, but the Department of Education has kind of drawn a line and said they need to be free and clear of adult education services. That's why an IET doesn't count, because they're still in remediation in the IET. And that can be confusing because if you're a teacher, you're thinking, man, it's great. You know, Maria's in college. She's in college. She's still in my class. She's still getting a brush up on skills. But, wow, she got college, and we had a party, and we celebrated. But in terms of the letter of the performance on this, that would not count as a post-secondary enrollment type 1B MSG. So it does seem kind of counterintuitive, but they really want a clear exit of AEL services for that performance to count. Great questions. You guys are really savvy.
We have another one. How does this work with ATB, ability to benefit?
Okay, with ATB, and a quick review here, ability to benefit programs are programs where a student is in an IET. They're in a career pathway IET. So they're going to be enrolled in AEL, Basic Education Services, Reading, Writing, Math, or ESL, and training. So it doesn't work with IET because they haven't exited Adult Education Services. They're getting that contextualized basic education. Now, there could be an instance where a student is in a program of study for, say, it's 2 semesters. And this really happens. If you're working in colleges, you know this happens. And they're getting ATB and they're getting their high school equivalency in the first semester. And whoopee, they passed the high school equivalency. They're done with high school equivalency classes. They're still in the training program, though. They're still in the program of study to get their training certificate. Say the next semester, they don't need you anymore. They don't need adult education anymore. And they still love you, but they don't need those courses anymore. If the student stopped going to HSC classes, didn't do any contextualization, but they just started taking the rest of the college courses they needed, after 90 days, they would have exited, and then you could count that performance. And this used to happen to me a lot when I used to teach at a college and work at a college because, you know, you get them up to speed, they get the basic education they need in the first semester, and then after that, they're kind of done. They've done their remediation, but they still got to get their training courses. So if they stop completely AEL services, then after 90 days of just pure training, that would count as a post-secondary enrollment MSG. On the 1B, it's complicated, and that's why I wanted to go back through it again. Some of y'all are probably scratching your head. If you had more questions now than you had at the beginning, that's probably good. Send them in and get your questions answered.
All right, so thank you for being here today. Anne-Marie is going to post a link that if you would like to give suggestions for future topics, please use that link to do that. Thank you very much.